After 60, stop chasing these things, or you'll never find peace. I used to believe peace was a place you arrived at after the noise died down, after the responsibilities were fulfilled, after the calendar finally had more white space than writing. I thought that if I worked hard enough, gave enough, healed fast enough, forgave deep enough, I would get there. That peace would appear, clear and unmistakable, like a sunrise breaking through the fog. But it never did, not in the way I expected. Because the truth is, peace doesn't arrive when life becomes perfect. It arrives when we stop demanding that it should. For years, I kept moving through early mornings filled with duty, through long days of giving without asking, through nights where sleep never softened the ache. I chased peace through productivity, through caregiving, through trying to be good. But somewhere along the way, I became so good at holding others that I forgot how to hold myself. And then one morning, something changed. Not the world, not my life. Just one small thing. I stopped. I sat by the window. I didn't plan it. I didn't intend for anything meaningful to happen. But as the steam rose from my cup of tea and the sky outside turned the color of quiet, I felt something settle, not in the room, but inside me. It was peace, not because I had earned it or solved anything, but because I had finally stopped running. You see, the chase doesn't end on its own, not after 60, not even after all the roles you've played begin to fade. The chase ends only when you choose to end it, when you turn gently inward and ask, what have I been running from all this time? This video is not a guide to becoming someone new. It's not a map to the future. It's a quiet invitation to return, to remember, to rest, to stop chasing what was never meant to give you peace in the first place. Perfection, approval, youth, control, answers. Because after 60, something sacred happens. The striving softens. The proving loses its urgency. And in the space that remains, something truer begins to bloom. Not a louder version of who you were, but a softer version of who you've always been. So if your soul is tired, not from age, but from effort, stay with me. If you've whispered to yourself, there must be more than this, this is for you. You don't need to fix anything right now. You don't need to improve or strive or achieve. You just need to breathe, to listen. To come back to the home you never really left, the peace that's been waiting beneath the noise all along. And if these words already feel like home, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. Because here we don't chase, we return. Again and again, to stillness, to truth, to ourselves. Chapter 1. Stop chasing validation. Sometimes the need to be seen starts long before we even know what we're looking for. It's not loud at first. It begins in subtle moments, when we brought home a drawing from school and quietly hoped someone would stop, look up, and say, "That's beautiful." When no one did, something small inside us hesitated, folded in a little, and we learned to try again. We smiled wider, tried harder, waited longer. We carried that longing like a soft ache into our teenage years, where it deepened without warning. We learned to be agreeable in conversations just to be liked. We learned to stay quiet so we wouldn't risk disapproval. And little by little, without even realizing it, we started shaping ourselves into who we thought others needed us to be. We brought that same habit into adulthood, into our relationships, into marriage, into parenting, into the workplace. We became skilled at earning affection. We knew how to say yes even when we meant no. We performed kindness like a well-rehearsed play, smiled when we were tired, offered our energy freely even when there was none left to give. And though we rarely spoke it out loud, deep down we were always waiting for someone to notice, to thank us, to say we'd done enough. But now you're here, you've crossed 60, maybe 70, maybe more, and still the ache lingers. You feel it in those quiet moments when the house is still, when your thoughts wander, When someone forgets to say thank you, or doesn't look back, or moves on without realizing how much of yourself you had quietly given. You wonder, why does it still hurt when people don't notice? Why do I still need to be told I matter? This isn't weakness. It isn't vanity. It isn't some leftover immaturity. It's the simple truth that for most of our lives, we were conditioned to believe that love had to be earned. That if we were good enough, helpful enough, selfless enough, then we'd be seen. Then we'd be safe. Then we'd be held. But what no one tells us, what life eventually insists we learn, is that peace doesn't come from being validated. It doesn't come from being praised or liked or understood. It comes from no longer needing those things to feel whole. The Buddha said that attachment is the root of suffering. And one of the most tender, invisible attachments we carry is to the idea of being seen and affirmed by others. We don't realize it, but we hand people the keys to our peace every time we wait for their approval to feel worthy. And the truth is, most people are too caught up in their own noise to truly see us. That's not cruelty. That's just the nature of human distraction. But if we wait for others to finally say the words we longed for as children, if we keep hoping someone will one day turn to us and say, "You did enough. You are enough. You can rest now. We'll be waiting forever." You don't need their applause. You don't need to be perfect or impressive or endlessly helpful. You don't need to keep bending yourself into versions of who you think you're supposed to be. You've already done more than enough. You've carried more than most will ever understand. This is the season of your life when you're allowed to stop chasing, not out of resignation, but out of wisdom. You're allowed to stop striving for recognition and start offering yourself presence. You don't have to prove your goodness anymore. You only have to remember it. You begin to feel that remembering in quiet ways. In the way you sit longer with your tea. In the way you look out the window without urgency. In the way your body sighs when no one is watching. Peace begins in the stillness where self-judgment ends. And in that space, a new kind of dignity arises. Not the kind that's granted by others, but the kind that's been living in you all along. The kind that comes from simply being. From saying, "I am not here to impress. I am here to be real." From offering yourself the gentleness you once waited for. So let yourself breathe. Let your shoulders soften. Let that old hunger for validation fall away like autumn leaves. You're home now. Not because someone said you were enough, but because you finally stopped asking. And that, dear soul, is more than enough. Chapter 2. Stop chasing control. There comes a point in life when you realize that control was never what you thought it was. For years, maybe decades, you believed that if you planned well enough, worked hard enough, stayed careful and prepared, you could somehow keep things from falling apart. You could keep people close, keep disappointment away, and maybe even avoid the kind of heartbreak you've seen happen to others. You told yourself that being responsible would protect you. You thought that if you just stayed one step ahead, nothing could surprise you. And so you controlled what you could, your schedule, your home, your words, your reactions. You took care of everyone. You made sure things were in order. You tried to be the calm in the middle of the chaos, but life doesn't move according to our best efforts. It doesn't ask for our permission to shift. Children grow and leave. Loved ones change. Illness arrives. People we thought would always be there quietly exit our lives, sometimes without warning, sometimes without explanation. And no matter how tightly we try to hold things together, life continues to unfold in ways we can't predict. That's not a failure. That's the nature of life. Impermanent, unscripted, alive. The deeper truth is, control is an illusion we hold onto because it makes us feel safe. It gives us the impression that we can keep pain at a distance. But all it really does is exhaust us. It keeps us on edge, always scanning for what might go wrong next, always adjusting ourselves to manage things that were never ours to carry. We mistake control for power, but real strength comes from the ability to meet each moment as it is, not from trying to force it into something else. What Buddhism teaches us is not to give up on life or sit passively by while everything happens around us. It teaches us to engage with presence, not attachment, to be fully here without grasping, to act with clarity but without the weight of needing everything to go a certain way. It reminds us that suffering isn't caused by what happens, but by our resistance to what is. When we cling to outcomes, to expectations, to the idea that we should always be able to fix things, we create suffering where there could have been space. Space for grace, for breath, for acceptance. Letting go of control doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop assuming that your peace depends on everything being exactly how you want it. It means allowing life to be what it is, and trusting that you can respond wisely even when it doesn't look how you hoped. It means softening instead of tightening, listening instead of predicting, being here instead of constantly managing what's next. And yes, it's hard, especially when you've spent so much of your life being the one who held everything together. But there's a kind of peace that can only be found on the other side of letting go. It's not loud. It doesn't come with a dramatic moment or a grand realization. It arrives quietly, like an exhale you didn't know you were holding. It shows up in the morning light that spills across your kitchen counter, in the moment you stop explaining yourself, in the space where you stop rehearsing how to say everything perfectly and just speak from the heart. When you stop chasing control, you begin to trust life again. You learn to ride the wave instead of fighting it. You begin to understand that uncertainty doesn't mean danger. That not knowing doesn't mean you're lost. That being present, truly present, is more powerful than anything you could ever plan. And from that space, you start to live differently. You start to rest. You start to breathe. And you start to discover that maybe, just maybe, you never needed to control anything to be okay. You just needed to be here, open, steady, and willing to let life meet you where you are. Chapter 3. Stop chasing busyness. At some point in life, being busy starts to feel like a form of survival. We fill our calendars, our days, even our thoughts, always doing, always fixing, always tending to something. Maybe at first it feels purposeful. There's satisfaction in crossing things off a list, in having somewhere to be, someone to care for, something to get done. But if you slow down long enough, you might begin to notice something underneath it all. The doing never ends. The list never finishes. And without realizing it, you begin to forget how to simply be. Busyness gives us a kind of identity. It makes us feel important, needed, useful. And maybe for a while it even gives us meaning. But meaning that depends on motion is always fragile. Because what happens when the kids grow up? When retirement comes? When your days grow quieter, not by choice but by age, by loss, by time itself? If we've built our sense of worth around staying busy, then stillness doesn't feel like peace. It feels like failure. But stillness isn't failure. Stillness is where we meet life without rushing past it. It's where the surface quiets and the deeper truths begin to speak. The Buddha often taught in silence as much as in words. His presence was calm, unhurried, rooted. He walked slowly. He ate slowly. He breathed with awareness. Because in slowness, we begin to see clearly. In quiet, we begin to feel again. But most of us are afraid of what might rise up when we stop moving. That's why we keep the noise going. The appointments, the errands, the constant checking, scrolling, cleaning, answering, planning. It's not that these things are wrong. It's that we use them to hide even from ourselves. We avoid the tender questions. Who am I when I'm not helping someone? Who am I when there's nothing left to fix? I remember speaking with a man named Thomas, newly retired after 40 years of working in finance. He told me that for the first 2 months after stepping away from his job, he didn't know what to do with himself. He repainted the house twice, organized every drawer, made to-do lists just to have something to cross off. Then one morning, sitting with a cup of coffee he hadn't rushed to make, he started crying. Not because he was sad, but because he hadn't been alone with himself in decades. I was afraid of the quiet, he said. But the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of everything I had never given myself time to feel. That's the turning point. When we stop seeing stillness as emptiness and start recognizing it as presence. There's no need to earn your rest anymore. You don't have to justify doing less. You've already done enough. You've shown up for others, held space, built things, healed things, sacrificed parts of yourself without asking for much in return. Now you are allowed to slow down, not because you've become less, but because you're finally ready to meet what's here. There's a deep kind of healing that only happens when we stop distracting ourselves. When we sit by the window and let the sunlight fall across the floor without rushing off to clean it. When we walk without checking the time. When we listen without thinking of what we'll say next. In those moments, life becomes simple again. Not smaller, just more spacious, more awake, more real. You are not lazy for resting. You are not selfish for saying no. You are not wasting your life when you step out of the rush and into your breath. You are, in fact, beginning to remember what it means to truly live. Stop chasing busyness. Let yourself belong to the quiet again. Let the days breathe. Let your body find its natural rhythm. Let your soul stretch out in the sunlight of slowness, because you were never meant to be a machine. You were meant to be a human being, and being, after all, was always the point. Chapter 4. Stop Chasing Youth. There is a subtle grief that often goes unspoken, the grief of watching your younger self slowly disappear. Not all at once, not with a single moment, but in quiet increments. A strand of gray where there once was color, a joint that aches where it once moved freely, a memory that slips just beyond reach. And for many of us, the instinct is to resist, to fight the slow turning of time, to chase after the glow we used to carry, like trying to catch a reflection in a stream that's already passed. It's understandable. We live in a world that worships youth, a culture that tells us beauty lives only in smooth skin and firm bodies, that relevance belongs to the fast, the new, the fresh. We are shown images every day that quietly whisper, "Don't age, don't slow down, don't become invisible." And so we spend energy, sometimes enormous energy, trying to hold back the inevitable. We die, we lift, we filter, we pretend. We try to keep up, not because we are vain, but because we're afraid of what will happen when the world no longer sees us. But Buddhism teaches us to see clearly, to look directly at impermanence and bow to it, not as an enemy, but as a truth that frees us. The body will change. The face will change. Everything will. And this is not something to mourn, it's something to soften into. Because what you lose in youth, you gain in presence, in tenderness, in depth. There is a kind of beauty that only comes with time. It's the kind of beauty that doesn't beg to be noticed, but quietly changes the room. It lives in the lines on your face that mark years of laughter, heartbreak, resilience. It lives in the steadiness of your gaze, the way you no longer need to prove yourself, the way you can hold someone's pain without flinching because you've lived through your own. I once met a woman named Grace in her 70s who told me she had never felt beautiful until she stopped trying to be young. She said, "When I was younger, I looked in the mirror to see if I measured up. Now I look to remember who I am." There was no performance in her presence, no need to compete, to impress, to win. just a quiet power that came from knowing her worth was not tied to how she looked, but to how she lived. You don't have to chase youth to stay alive. In fact, the chase often robs us of the joy that is only available now. While you're mourning the skin you used to have, you miss the wisdom that has settled underneath it. While you compare yourself to a younger version, you overlook the immense beauty of being a person who has survived, loved, lost, grown, let go. Your value has never been in your image. Your presence is the gift. Your wisdom is the glow. The softness in your voice, the quiet in your step, the stories etched into your hands, these are not signs of fading. They are signs that you are becoming more fully who you were always meant to be. The Buddha reminded us that clinging to what changes is the root of suffering. But when we release the chase, when we let the river of life carry us instead of trying to paddle backward, we discover something miraculous. Aging is not a loss. It's a deepening. It's a return to simplicity, to truth, to soul. So stop chasing youth. You haven't fallen behind, you've arrived. And what's here now is not a lesser version of who you were. It is the essence of all you've lived distilled into something quieter, wiser, and far more radiant than anything youth could offer. You are not fading. You are blooming, just in a season that no longer needs to shout. Chapter 5. Stop chasing perfection. Somewhere along the way, many of us began to believe that only when everything is right, everything in place, everyone pleased, every detail managed, can we finally allow ourselves to rest. We believed that peace must be earned and the price was perfection. So we tightened our standards, lengthened our to-do lists, replayed conversations, and curated every corner of our lives like a performance. But the applause never came, or if it did, it was brief, quickly replaced by the next demand, the next thing to fix. And even now, even after 60, you may still feel it. The quiet, gnawing pressure to get it just right. The table setting, the tone of your voice, the way your body moves, the way you age. You may not call it perfectionism anymore. You may call it care or responsibility or doing your best. But underneath those words is often the same silent ache, the belief that if you could just do everything better, cleaner, neater, maybe then you'd feel okay. Maybe then the anxiety would ease. But the truth is, perfection is not peace. It only pretends to be. It is a mirage, always just out of reach, always requiring more. And in chasing it, we exhaust ourselves not because we are weak, but because we are human. We forget that what the soul really craves is not flawlessness, but freedom. Not control, but connection. Not order, but the permission to exhale and be real. I once sat with an older woman named Irene, who confessed to me that even now, with her children grown and her house quiet, she couldn't go to bed unless every dish was washed, the cushions fluffed, the floor swept. It makes me feel calm, she said, but I'm not sure it makes me feel alive. And in that pause I saw it, that flicker of recognition, that all her life she had performed calmness. But real calm, true ease, had rarely been allowed to arrive. We think that perfection will protect us from judgment, from regret, from falling apart. But what if falling apart is exactly where the healing begins? What if it's not the polished version of you that deserves love, but the whole, unedited you? What if the crumbs on the counter, the forgotten birthday call, the trembling in your voice, what if all of it was still enough? Buddhism doesn't ask you to be flawless. It invites you to be awake. Awake to the reality that everything is already in motion, already changing, already passing. And in that movement, there is no place for perfection to cling. Only presence. Only breath. Only this. You were never meant to be a statue, untouched, unmoved, untarnished. You were meant to live, to age, to make mistakes, to forgive yourself, to laugh mid-sentence, to hold your grandchild with flower still on your hands. You were meant to bloom imperfectly, just like the lotus that rises from the mud, not despite the mess, but because of it. And maybe that's the truest kind of beauty, the kind that doesn't hide its scars, the kind that has nothing left to prove. Because the moment you stop chasing perfection is the moment you come home, not to a cleaner house or a neater past, but to yourself, as you are, with all the lines, the softness, the looseness of life that no longer needs polishing. There is a kind of peace that only arrives when you stop trying so hard to be better and begin, just gently, to be. Chapter 6. Stop chasing the past. There's a certain kind of ache that doesn't show up in the body, but lives quietly in the mind just beneath the surface of our smiles. It's the ache of memory, of what could have been, of moments we carry like stones in our pockets, long after the world has moved on. Sometimes the past whispers through scent, a certain perfume, a dish you haven't cooked in years, a song that comes on the radio when you least expect it. And suddenly you're there again, in that kitchen, in that goodbye, in that version of yourself you no longer know how to hold. And we try to be wise about it. We tell ourselves, let it go, it's over, it can't be changed. But the heart doesn't speak in logic, it speaks in longing. And often what it longs for isn't the past itself, but the feeling we had back then. The closeness, the clarity, the youth, the second chance. But here's the tender truth. The past does not need to be erased. It needs to be honored and then released. Buddhism teaches us that clinging is the root of suffering. And clinging to what was, to who we were, to what they said, to what we lost, only deepens the wound. You may still be carrying something that was never given back, an apology that never came, a relationship that ended without explanation, a moment you can't seem to forgive yourself for. And it's okay to acknowledge that pain. It's okay to grieve what didn't unfold the way it should have. But you are not meant to live there. You are not meant to replay the scene again and again, hoping this time the ending will be different. The past cannot be rewritten, but it can be integrated. It can become part of your wisdom, not your prison. I once met a man in his 70s who had carried guilt over something he said to his father, one sentence spoken in anger, 5 decades ago. His father passed not long after, and the words were never undone. "It's the one thing I can't stop thinking about," he told me, and I gently offered, maybe it's time to stop punishing the version of yourself who didn't yet know how to love better. Because that's the thing. We forget how much we've grown. We forget that the one who made the mistake is not the same person who lives in us today. Forgiveness is not pretending it didn't happen. It's saying, I will no longer abandon my peace for a moment I cannot return to. You don't have to make the past disappear. You only have to stop living as if your future depends on fixing it. The Buddha taught that every moment is new, every breath a beginning. And when you truly realize that, not just as an idea, but as an embodied truth, the past begins to soften. Not because it's no longer painful, but because it no longer defines you. Let the past be the soil. Let now be the seed. And let what grows from this moment forward be tended with kindness, not regret. After 60, you have earned the right to stop looking over your shoulder. You have the right to walk forward with both hands free, not empty, but full of everything you've learned. You are not what happened to you. You are the one who lived through it, who learned from it, who is still here breathing, watching the light shift on the wall, still becoming. And that, dear one, is enough. Chapter 7. Stop chasing comparison. Comparison doesn't always shout. Sometimes it tiptoes, quiet, subtle, harmless looking. You see someone's photo, a neighbor's success, a friend's family gathering where everyone seems so connected, and without meaning to, your breath catches. You feel something sink. It isn't jealousy exactly, It's more like, why not me? Or worse, what did I do wrong? We think we've outgrown this by now after 60, after all the storms we've weathered. But comparison is a shapeshifter. It finds new ways to whisper its doubts. You should have done more with your life. Look how well she aged. Why don't your children visit as often as hers? And just like that, we're pulled out of our own experience and into someone else's highlight reel, into the illusion that there is some silent scoreboard where worth is measured by how visible, productive, or adored we appear to be. But the truth, the one no one tells you when you're young, is that there is no scoreboard. There is no prize for being more admired, more accomplished, more remembered. The soul does not compete. It only longs to be whole. The Buddha taught that envy is a form of suffering, born from the mistaken belief that someone else's path threatens our own. But the Dharma is clear. There is room for all of us. The lotus does not look at the tree and feel less beautiful. The moon does not envy the sun. Comparison robs us of reverence. It pulls us away from the miracle of our own path, the sacredness of our exact unfolding. I once met a woman named Donna, 71, who told me she no longer used mirrors in the morning. Not because I'm ashamed, she said, but because they make me forget what matters. She'd spent years comparing her skin to younger women, her career to colleagues, her life to people she didn't even know. And one day, she simply stopped. Now, she told me, I start the day by touching my heart instead of judging my reflection. That's what this stage of life invites, not to perfect ourselves, but to return to ourselves. To look at the years we've lived, the stories we carry, the quiet resilience etched into our hands and say, without apology, this is enough. You don't need to look like anyone else, love like anyone else, live like anyone else. You don't need to match someone's timeline or mirror their joys. Your worth is not diminished because someone else's light is shining. It's okay if your journey looks different. It's supposed to. Buddhist wisdom reminds us, we all awaken at different moments. A flower blooms when the season is right, not a minute sooner, not a moment late. So today, when the voices rise that say, you should have done more, been more, you can gently bow to them and let them pass. Because your life is not a contest, it's a path, a living, breathing, beautiful path, and it's yours alone. And when you stop chasing comparison, something miraculous begins to happen. You start to truly see the bird outside your window, the softness of your own voice, the quiet courage it takes to be exactly who you are without trying to be anyone else. And that kind of peace, no one can take from you. Chapter 8. Stop chasing closure. There's a quiet ache that follows us, sometimes for years, the ache of things left unsaid, stories left unfinished, endings that never arrived in the way we hoped they would. We tell ourselves, if only I could understand why. If only they would apologize. If only we had one last conversation, one more chance to explain. And so we wait for a call that never comes, for a door that won't open, for the past to turn around and make itself right. But closure is not a gift that others can always give us. Some people will never say they're sorry. Some chapters will never have neat conclusions. Some wounds will never receive the justice we think they deserve. And still, life asks us to go on. At some point, we must stop tying our healing to the hope that someone else will return and fix what they left broken. The longer we wait for them to see, to understand, to change, the longer we keep ourselves trapped in the very pain we wish to escape. Closure, we discover, is not something that happens to us. It's something we decide, quietly, privately, sacredly. It's the moment we say, I do not need your apology to free myself from this story. It's when we learn to bless what cannot be explained and release what has already taken enough of our peace. It's not about pretending it didn't hurt, it did. It's not about erasing the past, you can't. It's about softening your grip around it so your hands are free to hold something else. Something living, something now. I remember once meeting an elderly man who had lost touch with his only daughter. For years, he waited for her to reach out. Every birthday, every New Year, he left the porch light on. But one day, he told me, he sat down beneath a maple tree and wrote her a final letter. He didn't send it. He didn't even sign it. He just folded it and buried it beneath the roots. And in doing so, he said, I gave the pain somewhere to rest so I could rest too. We think we need closure to move forward. But maybe we only need permission. Permission to stop waiting. Permission to live even with questions unanswered. Permission to honor the hurt and still walk away from it, not with bitterness but with grace. You can carry the memory without carrying the weight. You can carry the love even if the person is gone. You can say goodbye without hearing it said back. And that is enough, because peace does not require perfection. It only asks that you stop turning back toward a door that has already closed, and turn gently, slowly, toward the life that is still open to you. Chapter 9: The Final Return. And now, as this quiet hour draws to a close, I want to say something simple, not profound, not polished, just real. You've been here with me, not rushing, not fixing, not striving, just breathing, just remembering. For nearly an hour, we've walked together through what so many of us spend a lifetime chasing. Approval, control, perfection, youth, closure, busyness, clarity. We've reached, we've strived. We've exhausted ourselves trying to earn a peace that was never meant to be earned in the first place. And here you are now, not because you've conquered all that chasing, but because something in you is ready to rest. Not give up, but lay down the weight. That's the quiet miracle of this age. After 60, we don't need to keep climbing. We are finally allowed to sit down, to return, to feel the sunlight through the window and let it be enough. To touch the softness in our own breath without needing to prove anything. You don't need to explain who you are anymore. You don't need to ask for permission to stop running. No one else has to say it, so let me. You are allowed to let it all go. You are allowed to come home, to yourself. And if this video has stirred something in you, even a single quiet truth you forgot you knew, I invite you to stay. Not just for this one moment, but for the journey we're taking here together. Subscribe to this channel, not because you're missing something, but because you're remembering something. Something sacred, something real. Leave a comment if your heart has anything to say. Share this with someone who might still be chasing without knowing why. And above all, take this moment for yourself. Sit quietly, place your hand on your heart. Whisper to the life that carried you here, I forgive you, I free you. I welcome you home. Because peace was never waiting on the other side of achievement. It was waiting at the bottom of the breath you never had time to take. This is not the end. This is the return to your breath, to your body, to the enoughness that was always yours. And now, finally, you get to live like it. Welcome home.